Welcome to Beowulf Part 3. So in this last installment of the video lectures on Beowulf, we'll be talking about how the poem relates to Homer, and then at the very end talking about how Beowulf fits into our wider understanding of the epic tradition in Western literature. For a start, we can see lots of similarities between societies in Beowulf and Homer. So there's a focus on aristocratic kings and heroes, patrilineal systems, so things are passed down through the father's line. There's a focus on funerals, for instance, Shield Chieftain and Beowulf, as we saw funerals for Hector and other characters in Homer. There's a focus on what does it take to be a good king, and so this requires dispensing goods, much like we saw in the Homeric system of Kleos, and especially with Geros, right, the prizes that you get from fighting enemies. Fighting enemies is next on the list, in addition to blood feuds, so we see Grendel, Grendel's mother, various tribes fighting other tribes, and compensation reparation. We've seen this also in Homer, as well as a focus on queens that accompany the kings. And so in Beowulf we get Wealhtheow and the cup, but in Homer, for instance, we get Hector's wife Andromache in that scene with their son. Both of these epics also explore what does it take to be a hero. Okay, so in Beowulf we get quotes like, "Anyone with gumption and a sharp mind will take the measure of two things, what's said and what's done." This can be easily mapped onto the phrase that we keep returning to for the definition of hero as a speaker of words and a doer of deeds. Okay, at line 250 we also get, "This is no mere hanger-on in hero's armor," right? So again, a focus on what makes a hero. Is it the armor? Maybe. Especially when we think of the scene with Patroclus and Achilles from the Iliad, and thinking about how the armor might make the hero in that scene. And then at the very end, in line 3007, we get the quote, "He worked for the people, but as well as that, he behaved like a hero." So being a hero involves working with your people, much as in Homer we talked about a Basileus as a hero interacting with the people of his land. Heroes in both epics also perform a lot of formal boasts about their prowess. They also deal out and get a lot of prizes, or geros in the Homeric word. And there's lots of talk of fame, glory, and mortality in both epics, right? So these seem to be the central concerns of heroes, and what people expect heroes to be thinking about and doing in these epics. And lastly, there's often a sidekick to the hero. So Beowulf has Wiglaf, just as Achilles has Patroclus. And finally, we see lots of ties between aristocratic tribes or families. So Hrothgar formally adopts Beowulf, and then we see several instances of Xenia in Beowulf, even though Xenia isn't necessarily a concept attributed to that culture. Okay, but it's the same kind of practice of giving gifts and practicing hospitality to other aristocratic guests. In addition to these societal similarities, we see lots of similar narrative techniques between Beowulf and Homer. For instance, the ekphrasis of the sword. There's lots of descriptions of weapons and gear. Beowulf also recounts lots of previous adventures to other characters, and you can see those listed on the slide. There's also several mythological parallels or exemplars that the narrator talks about, or the characters talk about. And bards use inset songs, which we've seen before mostly in the Odyssey. But you can see the two examples from Beowulf here, as well as a third example, which is not relayed by a bard, but by the narrator, and is called the Lay of the Last Survivor. Something you may not have noticed as you were reading Beowulf is that there's lots and lots of ring composition, which, just to remind ourselves, ring composition is a sequence of scenes or statements that are arranged in an A-B-C-B-A format, so it forms kind of a ring coming back to the beginning. We gave the example of Glaucus and Diomedes meeting in Iliad of Book 6, right, when Glaucus says, "Which mortal are you? Don't want to fight immortals." Story about fighting immortals. Then he says, "No, I don't want to fight immortals. If you're immortal, come fight me." Or more succinctly, we also talked about Cardi B's Bodak Yellow, in which she says, "I don't bother with these hoes. Don't let these hoes bother me." So I'm not going to go through all of these examples of ring composition, but they will be here in the video. And I can post them if you want me to as images on our Blackboard page. But take a look at these and look over exactly what scenes are going on here. One I do want to specifically talk about is the overall ring composition of Beowulf as an entire poem. Okay, so we can break it down this way. We get the introduction, the fight with Grendel, celebrations, fight with Grendel's mother, more celebrations, fight with the dragon, and the conclusion. And you can see a more detailed version of this here, in which you can also break down the prologue and the epilogue into ring compositions of a sort. So in the prologue we get the panegyric for Scyld, Scyld's funeral, the history of the Danes, and Hrothgar's order to build Heorot. And so we get essentially the same content, but in an opposite order in the epilogue. We get Beowulf's order to build his barrow, the history of the Geats after Beowulf and the messenger's prophecy, Beowulf's funeral, and the eulogy for Beowulf. And so finally, the funeral scenes are very similar between each epic. In Beowulf, an unnamed Geat woman mourns. She talks about how the great nation is doomed. She says her nation, or the narrator tells us, her nation invaded, enemies on the rampage, bodies in piles, slavery, and debasement. And this is at the very end of Beowulf. But in the Iliad, Andromache, Hecuba, and Helen all mourn over Troy and the people it's lost. So in this scene, Andromache cradles the head of Hector after he has died and says, "All the solemn wives and children you guarded will go off soon in the hollow ships, and I will go forth with them." Okay, and in this passage, she's talking about how all of the wives and children that Hector had fought for in the Trojan War will be taken off as slaves. So both epics not only focus on the plights of heroes and kings and aristocratic families, but they also explore, or at least mention, what's going to happen to the people who survive these wars and these altercations. What happens to the women and the children when the heroes die, and what happens when they come back from war. So how do we explain all of these parallels between Homer and Beowulf? And the answer to this is probably common ancestry or polygenesis, and it's probably not coincidence or borrowing. It probably isn't coincidence because there are too many significant parallels for this to be, just by chance. And it's probably not borrowing or influence because we don't have any direct evidence for transmission of Greek or Roman literature to the inhabitants of Britain during this time. Even though the Romans were there, and they probably brought some texts with them, we don't have any evidence that these were translated or transmitted in any way to the inhabitants of Britain. So we would be looking for something like a direct mention of Achilles or Hector or Odysseus or something like that, and we just don't have that evidence. So we have to rule out borrowing or influence. It's probably not coincidence, and that leaves common ancestry and polygenesis. So if we are going to explain these similarities via common ancestry, we'd have to look back to the Indo-Europeans, which we talked about in the very first video. So we'd say something like, because the inhabitants of Britain who wrote Beowulf and the Greeks have the same common ancestry, tracing back all the way to the Indo-Europeans, we see a lot of the similar things arise separately in literatures from different periods. A polygenesis argument would look something like Joseph Campbell's monomyth theory. So if you remember, we talked about this at the ending of Gilgamesh. Joseph Campbell came up with this thing called the hero's journey, which you can see here on the PowerPoint slide, which sought to combine all of the extant kind of epic hero's journey poetry and all those stories into this kind of abstract pattern. Okay, and we said there are some problems with this, but more or less if you squint, you can kind of apply it to all these epic journeys, and Beowulf isn't exempt from that. Joseph Campbell's monomyth theory is essentially a polygenesis construction. So it's an argument that says, well, these heroes' journeys arise as a symptom of the human condition, and that's why they're similar. So assignment 4 will ask you to pick one of these, common ancestry or polygenesis, and use it to explain a certain set of significant parallels that you find between Beowulf and a Homeric text. So you essentially want to approach Beowulf as if you are Homer, coming to the text for the first time, and you want to identify what exactly Homer would find interesting or familiar about Beowulf as a poem. Hopefully these video lectures have set you up to complete this assignment well. Again, if you have any questions, please post them on the discussion board or feel free to email me and I'll respond, or we can also set up a time for a Zoom discussion.